All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another movie podcast. We are two Canadian film lovers, two cinephiles here, and we thought it would be the perfect time to talk about Canadian filmmaker par excellence, magnifique, the one and only Denis Villeneuve. Of course, Dune Part 1 has just dropped as we're recording this. We've both recently seen that film, but we thought it would be good not only to share our thoughts about that film, but we're just going to rip through the whole filmography of Villeneuve because he really has risen to be one of the most talked about, most beloved directors around the world. We might be showing a bit of our Canadian bias today, but he is my favorite filmmaker in the industry today. And I don't say that lightly. I know he's up there for you. I know you're a Fincher fan. I don't know, where would Villeneuve be? Like top 5, top 10? Have you given that much thought where he would land with directors currently in the industry today?
Probably top 5. But it's hard to guess. I feel like Denny is. It still feels like he's new because he has done so much incredible work in a very short amount of time in the last decade. Like he's older and he has worked before that, but really breaking on the scene and really setting an incredibly high bar in his work has just been over the last several years. And so in my mind, every time I think about this, I'm just like, well, yeah, I guess he is. He's consistently a masterclass, and I just don't think of him quite as being around, because I didn't grow up with him, and so I need to give more attention to him. Really.
Yeah, it was actually 10 years ago. So those of you that aren't familiar with Denis Villeneuve, maybe you're just getting to know him now through Dune or more of his recent works, Blade Runner 2049, etc. He's been around. He's 54 years old. He was born in 1967 in Quebec, Canada. 10 years ago, I noticed Variety Film actually pegged him and listed him as one of the top 10 directors to watch. Well, that was a little prescient because in the last decade, certainly he has skyrocketed across multiple genres, but he's been dabbling in sci-fi of late. Another quote I want to read about him that I found here just before we get into our thoughts on Dune. Few filmmakers of the 21st century have risen to prominence and prestige with the forcefulness of Blade Runner 2049 director Denis Villeneuve, whose seemingly unstoppable career has been bolstered by a steady balance of critical respect and commercial success. In fact, maybe Christopher Nolan is the only other person who comes to mind, and the similarities between the two of them are hard to ignore. I thought that was quite interesting, and that's one thing I appreciate about him. Maybe we'll just talk generally what we appreciate about him as a director, or what we can come to expect, maybe stylistically or creatively in his films. But one thing I appreciated is he can make a big blockbuster movie like Dune or Blade Runner, but it also has sort of a bit of an art house feel to it as well. So he combines the big sweeping epic with the interesting contemplative stuff to ponder when you leave the theater. That's something I really appreciate. Not too many directors can kind of blend that together, and I think he pulls that off masterfully time and time again. Just generally, Adam, what are some of the things that you've observed as we've just revisited his films the last few months, all of them? What are some general observations about him stylistically or the craft?
Well, it's just that description you just gave it's just funny because just yesterday reading how he confessed that at the end of making Blade Runner 2049, he's like, I guess I just made a big budget art house film. Yeah. And sort of observing that maybe that's the weakness commercially of the film too, even though you and I both love that film. But yeah, and in the Christopher Nolan comparisons are funny because it's known that they're more than colleagues, that they're friends.
Yeah.
And that's a really awesome thing to see them interact and support one another. And when we can catch them conversing with one another on podcasts or videos, it's exciting. I see far more comparison because, again, I'm a diehard Fincher fan. David Fincher is the storyteller and filmmaker that I adore. And sometimes don't even necessarily know why, but I see a lot of similarities in tone and in storytelling between Villeneuve and Fincher, because I think of Nolan more, Nolan is the spectacle, the intelligent spectacle, but conceptual. And I don't see a lot of that necessarily going on. Certainly the caliber is equal, but Villeneuve is it's, you could be said that those are more straightforward, simpler stories that are being told, but in an incredibly elegant way. That again, the cinematography, the camera movements, the feelings that his stories often evoke, for me at least, are very reminiscent of what I'm usually coming away with after a Fincher film or anthology or something.
That's a good comparison, certainly. I mean, one movie we'll talk about, Prisoners, gets a lot of comparison to Zodiac, and that's sort of the obvious comparison. But I think stylistically, there is a lot of overlap there. One thing I've appreciated, another thing, is his versatility. You know, he's not stuck in one particular genre. And as we go through sort of his whole filmography, we'll see from drama to psychological thriller to sci-fi to even a little bit of romance mixed in. You know, he's able to work comfortably across genres, which I respect. He's not sort of the equivalent of an actor being typecast. You know, he's able to broadly direct different types of films. And I think the music and the score in his films are incredible as well. They kind of add to the atmosphere of the film. And he's worked with, you know, Hans Zimmer over the years. You know, we got some good Radiohead needle drops in one of his films, and so I find the auditory aspect of his film really adds to the emotion of the film, and that's true of many directors, but that's something I really identify in his films, and thematically too. I think a lot of his films sort of explore sort of the pitfalls of navigating a world of violence and evil, and sometimes the protagonist is stuck in a world surrounded by violence or evil, and how the choices that they make in the midst of that chaos and trauma. And, you know, he hits that from different angles, but that's a theme that sort of overlaps in many of his films. And oftentimes the female protagonists in some of the films are quite interesting as well. So I think there's a lot of reasons to get into the world of Denis Villeneuve. And I want to say right out of the gate, go ahead, Adam, a couple more thoughts.
I was just going to say, he is like what you were just pointing at. He is what does really set him apart, I think, from some of these other ones we've mentioned. He is deeply philosophical, and just even this morning, as I was thinking through the thematic comparisons or relationships of a lot of these films, I think actually it could be said, or at least for me in my brain, I could even summarize it like there's this constant examination of human choice, and human choice. And if I think through some of these films, human choice in the face of someone else's suffering, human choice in the face of evil, human choice in the face of existence itself, human choice in the face of the nature of time. Like all of these things are at work. And again, it's not just these examinations of evil and time and the suffering of another, but it's actually about the responsibility or the opportunity that we bear in the midst of it, which makes it something rich to think about and wrestle with, but of course at the same time, just deeply compelling narratives. And so
yeah, and that's the beauty of that theme, because that transcends time and place, right? So we could be 10,000 years in the future, where we're going shortly in the world of Dune or Blade Runner 2049, right? And yet those themes sort of come back to our own situation, and they leave us pondering the world in which we live and how we navigate the choices we make. And so I find it quite fascinating and effective that he's able to do that across genre with different interesting protagonists and situations the characters find themselves in. So those of you that are, keeping score, and this is the sort of Academy side of things, Villeneuve's films have been nominated for 18 Academy Award nominations going back to 2010, last decade. So that's pretty impressive, with 3 wins, with Arrival in 2016 leading the way with 8 nominations, Blade Runner with 5, Sicario with 3, Prisoners and Incendies with 1. So again, there's been some critical acclaim there, as well as some popular appeal to his films. So why don't we jump into Dune? I want to say, before we get into any of these films, we can't help but include some minor spoilers, or maybe major spoilers, in some of these. So I know Dune is just recently released in the last couple of weeks, and maybe you haven't seen it yet. So right here, if you go to this timestamp, you can go to the next movie we're going to talk about and avoid any spoilers in Dune. And for the rest of the films, I really encourage you, watch all these films. We'll wait. You can come back and hear our thoughts as you're pondering your own thoughts about these films. So I'll put all the timestamps for when we're talking about each individual film in the show notes. But please be warned, be forewarned. Spoiler alert. Okay, so let's jump into our time machine. We're fast forwarding now 10,000 years in the future to this epic world of Dune. Of course, Dune is from the classic sci-fi novel. It's adapted from Frank Herbert's novel, which I believe is in the 1960s. Denis Villeneuve has said he read the book and was captivated by it at the age of 13. And so this is really is a bit of a passion project, certainly for him. And we certainly see that passion in this sort of epic scale and scope on the big screen. Adam, you just saw Dune literally in the last 48 hours, I believe. What were your sort of initial impressions coming out of the theater, or going into the theater versus coming out of it, perhaps?
Well, yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, going in, honestly, I was just, I was coming in pretty clean in the sense that didn't have a whole lot of expectations. I was just literally just looking forward to the new Denis Villeneuve film. I'm not a fanboy when it comes to Dune. I know that's with this kind of IP, like that's a lot. It comes from, for a lot of people's perspective, it comes with a lot of that baggage of expectations. And for me, I kind of kept it clean on purpose, where I did not grow up reading the book. I've never read the book. Years ago, I watched the David Lynch 1980s film. I never saw the TV miniseries that existed at some point. I never even seen is it Jabowski, the documentary about the failed attempt. You know, so it's all pop cultural lore that I'm aware of that exists, but it's not a story that's deeply personal for me at all. And so I was coming in pretty clean and just looking forward to it. And coming out, I was just enthralled. It was just a really, it actually felt like the kind of film I haven't seen in a long time. And I felt that way about another film recently, The Last Duel. These were two theatrical experiences where it's like, man, I grew up with this kind of cinematic experience, and I feel like I haven't felt this in a long time. Where for Dune, there's just something very classically epic about it. And it's not trying to be more than it is, which is simply tell this dense and rich and complicated story, but doing so in a very accessible way. I think it really does this incredible thing. I actually, when I left the house yesterday to go see it with a couple of my kids, my wife didn't come. She wasn't interested, but she also was like, "What is it? What's Dune?" And I was trying to think of what the comparison is, and I'm like, I think sci-fi Game of Thrones, maybe, which then in a sense almost was like a red flag. It was like, oh man, is this?
Why are you taking the kids then? Yeah,
yeah, well, that too. But I was just like, is this going to be too complicated, too dense? There's too much going on, and it is dense. It is a complicated narrative and world building. But I would say by no means does that weigh on the experience. Really, the writing, the screenplay really did a fantastic job of walking us through that. At what cost, I have no idea in terms of those who read the original novel. But for me, it was a very clean, classically epic story that only got better over 2.5 hours. At the halfway point, I was feeling very content and entertained and engaged. But and I thought, this is fine. This is all it is. But by the end, it was very much edge of my seat, very much looking forward to the next chapter, and hopefully we get that.
Yeah, and for those that aren't aware, if you didn't heed our warning, haven't seen it, and you're still watching, this is part one. This is Dune part one. And I've talked to some people, they didn't realize it was part one going in, so they kind of felt it was left hanging, and that's by design. I read the book years and years ago, and I'm trying to revisit it now. It is very dense. The thought was that there's no way that anyone could do justice in adapting this for the big screen. It's just so epic. It's so sprawling. There's so much detail in the book. And so, I mean, kudos for Villeneuve, because he's walking that fine line between falling into the one pitfall of just over explaining everything to the point where it's just overcooked, and the other extreme, maybe just not giving enough information to those like yourself who aren't familiar with the world and the narrative. And I thought he walked that line pretty well. There's some things that are explained. There's some things from the book that weren't explained or weren't actually put on the big screen. But the reality is there's just so much. I mean, this is why Jaworski wanted to make, like, I think it was a 12 or 14 hour epic, because you really need 12 to 14 hours to get all the details from the book on screen. But I thought he did a great job with that. I thought, the world building, this is not, I'm going to say right now, this is not my favorite Denis Villeneuve movie, but I think it's the most impressive and immersive world building of all of his movies. What he was able to do, like, let's just give him production design right now. Let's give him the Academy, just engrave that Academy Award right now. Cinematography, I think also, let's just start engraving that award. It's just breathtaking. Please, I'm going to echo what Villeneuve's been saying for years. Go see this movie on the big screen. This is a movie more than any other, probably this year or in recent years, that really needs to be experienced on the big screen. It's so immersive. You actually feel like you're actually was sweating at one point because I was so hot because I'm watching this desert on the screen. I was actually, it's a pretty cool theater I'm in, but I was just like, I just take and drink of water after water after water as they're sweating, and they're wearing these suits that recycle their sweat, and we didn't have that luxury watching. So I just thought it was just phenomenal, immersive experience. What were your thoughts on some of the other technical aspects of the film?
Well, I was going to say you named two, but I would think hand the Oscar to three things, because I've never seen cinematography, production design, and visual effects work in such harmony, so seamlessly together. I mean, maybe I have, but it not in recent memory. Right. Because those three things, it was honestly shocking, because there has to be a lot of computer graphics going on to pull all this off, and yet all of it feels organic. It feels rich and textured and tactile, and that's Villeneuve's vision, but it's also the cinematography, the production design, the visual effects working hand in hand in a way that is so rare. It's just, it can't be more immersive in the sense of feeling like a real world. And that's sometimes the biggest criticism of these big epics, especially sci-fi epics, or even like ancient empire epics. Like, it's just like there's so much CG, it takes you out of it, or it's so noticeable. And in this case, it just felt so real, and it was amazing.
Yeah. And you mentioned The Last Duel. That's an ancient epic that felt the same, right? It just felt so immersive. And so I appreciate that. It just seamlessly weaves together that organic feel with, obviously there's some visual effects and CGI, but it's really not noticeable. You just feel like you're right there. It was filmed mostly in Jordan, and they had actually went to the heat of the day and the heat of the season in Jordan to kind of get the perfect atmosphere, the perfect lighting and heat. And I've read some interviews with the cast. It was very taxing for them. But across the board, I think everybody who works with Villeneuve has said, people are lining up to work with him. It's almost like, give another kudos to another one of my favorite directors, Terrence Malick, when he left for 20 years and came back to do The Thin Red Line. Sean Penn's like, I will be in this film for $1. And he was, right? People just line up. And I think Villeneuve's become that sort of persona that people would just line up and would love to work on a film with him. That's why you have people like Josh Brolin coming back for repeat performances with him. So, performances, cast, speaking of cast, how did you feel about the cast performances? Were there any that were high water, low water?
No, I wouldn't say any low water. I mean, if anything, that was maybe the least noticeable element of the film, because I wouldn't say there was any weaknesses. But again, the story is so epic and sprawling.
Right. It's
hard to have enough time and attention to really be invested in any particular characters. But again, by the end, I felt a little differently about that. But everyone is Timothée Chalamet, Rebecca Ferguson, Oscar Isaac. I mean, that family dynamic, really. I mean, actually, they probably did I should give more credit for just how beautifully portrayed in the midst of an epic world. They beautifully portrayed a family unit in, an impossible setting of being royalty and ruling an empire. But
my hair is paying homage to Timothée Chalamet today. My beard is paying homage to Oscar Isaac. So there we go. Yeah, I thought across the board the casting was superb. Jason Momoa, I actually really enjoyed his performance as well. He seemed like he just threw himself into a fun, action-packed role there. But Chalamet, this is not a deep character study, at least in part one. And if I'm going to give a slight critique, and again, we love this movie, but it's not my favorite of Villeneuve's. It's a little light on the depth of the characterization in some of the characters. I think a lot of them were just sort of setting the table, and we'll see more from some of these characters. Javier Bardem's character, of course, and others in part two forthcoming. So I think my wife had this comment. She loved it too. She came out of the theater. We went as a family. And she said we were comparing Conjuring with Lord of the Rings. That was one of the other epics that
Yep.
we kind of made a connection to. And she said, I love them both, but I think I liked Lord of the Rings a little more because even in the first part of Lord of the Rings, there seemed to be a little more depth of characterization. Some of the characters, you get to know their stories. And again, she was going in green like you. She didn't know really the backstory of Dune. She wanted a little bit more about information about the characters and the plot, which is a fair critique, I would say.
Yep.
I would agree in a certain sense. So at the end of the day, where does this fall in the in your rankings of all the Villeneuve's films? If you were to place this one in the
Well, I'm just going to
you've
glance
seen?
at my rankings, and so what's funny is that all of Denis' films are incredible, and I have 8 of his films on my list of rankings, and all of them except 1 are 4 stars or more. So for me to say, it's
Right.
a lower number,
Relative. It's a bell curve.
relative. It's very relative. But I mean, upon the second viewing, maybe it'll go higher, and especially with part 2. But right now, out of 8, it's 6, but it's 4 stars. It's a solid 4 stars, but I've got it at 6 at the moment, which again is very relative because it still is a great film, and there's so much to appreciate.
Yeah, and I similar to me, like, because I love so many of his films, the fact that I put this as 5 out of the 10 films that I've seen, and I have it 5th right now, that's not a knock on this film by any stretch. It's just how much respect and love I have for the rest of his filmography. And again, it's hard to really evaluate because it's part 1. When you watch the entire sort of vision unfolding, it might elevate part 1 as well as part 2. So stay tuned and go see the movie because part 2 hasn't even been funded yet, and it would be a great cinematic tragedy if we only have part 1 of Denis Villeneuve's vision of Dune. So I'm hoping it continues to do well at the box office and we get a part 2. He's ready to film as early as next year. So fingers crossed we'll get the rest of his vision of this adaptation. All right, so that's Dune. We want to spend a bit more time with that one, but we do want to spend a few minutes talking about going down memory lane, all of his previous films. So you mentioned 8 that you've seen. There are 2 other films early on in his works that I'll just mention very briefly. So his initial film was in 1998. It's called August 32nd on Earth. It's a drama romance. It's a brief synopsis. The protagonist, female protagonist, she, after surviving a traumatic car accident, she proposes an idea to her longtime best friend that they should make a baby together. He's got a girlfriend, so he's kind of really taken aback by this proposal. Reluctantly, after she pesters him, agrees with the proviso that they need to make a baby in the desert. So Dune is not the first movie where Denis Villeneuve has taken his film to a desert. The setting for this actually goes to outside Salt Lake City in sort of a salt desert. And it's an interesting sort of two-hander, drama romance after this traumatic car accident experience. It's number 9 of 10 for me, but it's worth seeing if you'd like to see some of his early works. You kind of see the raw materials of some of his passion and his style in his early work. The second film by him, 2 years later, is a film called Maelstrom. It's my least favorite of the 10 I've seen. It's a psychological drama about a depressed woman who becomes romantically involved with the son of a man that she killed in a hit and run accident. I don't know if Villeneuve had a traumatic car accident in his childhood, but his first 2 films involve car accidents which lead to trauma and female protagonists in the wake of it. And so it's sort of a dreamlike, surreal film. It's actually narrated. There's certain parts that are narrated by a talking fish, which might be a deal breaker for some of you. But it's kind of an interesting, surreal, sort of dreamlike psychological drama. And he'll come back to another film that's very surreal later in his career. So that's my least favorite, but it's a 3 out of 5, 6 out of 10. By no means bad films, but certainly he's raw. He's pretty green, and greater things await Denis Villeneuve. So his first film, if we fast forward now to 2009, he takes basically 9 years off. He feels that these first 2 films were failures. I mean, I think directors are their biggest critics. I don't think they're failures by any stretch, but he takes time, he stays home, raises his kids. Then he gets back in the ring in 2009 with a very personal film for him. I mentioned he was born and raised in Quebec in Canada. And the film 2019 is called Polytechnique. And it's a film that is based on a true harrowing event here in our Canadian culture that happened in 1989. So 20 years after the events, what's called the Montreal Massacre, mass shooting at the École Polytechnique. And he reenacts the events of the incident seen through the eyes of two students who witnessed a gunman murdering 14 young women. And so I know I was getting on you and some mutual friends of ours to watch this one, Kleiner, and I know you did recently, and I think you really enjoyed this movie. I mean, it's hard to say you enjoy it given the theme, but from a cinematic perspective, I thought it was a masterstroke. What were your thoughts after your first viewing of this film?
I just thought it was important. It was an important work of art or important story to tell. And as I was watching it and finding myself really swept up in it, caught up in it. I mean, actually, even as I was watching it, I was thinking about what he was doing by telling this true story and on behalf of the victims and with their permission and blessing. But thinking about other directors and stories that have done similar things about these atrocities of gun violence, like I think of Gus Van Sant's Elephant. Mm-hmm. And after the film, just reading a handful of reviews, there was a lot of comparisons to Elephant. I don't remember what year Elephant came out, but Elephant was sort of Gus Van Sant's sort of, I believe, loosely told story of the Columbine shooting. I don't think it was explicitly about that event. I might be wrong on that, but it was definitely related to that or reflective of that. And that film sort of explores the individuals, the teenagers and the gunmen and their motivations or what was going on in their lives around the times of this event. Polytechnique is very different. It just tells the story, just tells the events and recounts the atrocities. And some accuse that as being a weakness. I saw that nothing but as a strength in this case. Because I saw it as a valuable confrontation with evil, because we from time to time, and not often and not always, need to simply be confronted with the realities of our world, the realities of evil. We don't necessarily need to examine all of the motivations and context from within, just simply acknowledging and being confronted by these horrible acts and being left to respond ourselves of what to do with that. As we see a couple of the victims in the months after the events of how they are healing or not healing after that. And to me, that they present it, in this case, the film presents the killer in exactly the way the world received his acts, with no further examination other than the notes or the records that he shared, and that's it. And that's a hard. I mean, for the actor who portrayed that, that's a very hard thing to portray, because you can dehumanize it, right? Make it an archetype of evil, and that's by no means what they do. But again, I think it served a very particular purpose and did so exquisitely with a masterwork of art, but also sensitivity to the realities and the victims and their families. So
that's very well said. The only thing I'll add is I think it was a very smart choice to film this movie in black and white, which they did. It adds to the bleakness of the theme of the movie, and it's basically a snowstorm outside. But also, Denis Villeneuve was very sympathetic and cautious not to glorify the violence or the bloodshed. So filming in black and white, you don't see the blood as graphically in the film. That being said, it is unflinching. It doesn't hold back on portraying the events as they happen, and it's quite harrowing. But they don't glorify or overanalyze the motives of the killer, like you mentioned, other than it's just a misogynistic person who has a real anti-feminist agenda. And I love, as you alluded to, it doesn't just show the events, but it shows the aftermath, the consequences, good, bad, and ugly, the trauma. Sometimes we think, these events are in the news more regularly in the United States than here in Canada, but any events like this, they're in the news, they come and they go. And sometimes we forget that the victims and their families are left with the trauma that they carry for the rest of their lives, which are even passed on to their children. And it's just a very poignant final note on which this film ends, with one of the female survivors and how she's when she's about to give birth, whether it's a daughter or a son, she's going to teach that daughter or that son how to live with integrity and love in a world full of violence. And I thought it was very well made. It was very respectful I think Villeneuve alone could make this movie because he lives in that context. He knows the backstory of this, and he was very respectful. He chose not to actually film it on site where the events happened, just out of respect for the survivors and students. So they relocated to another similar location. So I think a great amount of empathy and poise, and like you said, a very important film. Polytechnique. Where does this land on your 1 to 8 scale, ranking wise?
Yeah, for me, ranking all eight films, or these 8 films. It's a 5-star masterpiece in my mind, but of course a difficult masterpiece that don't look forward to revisiting very often. But because of the nature of it being 5 stars, it falls at number 3 for me out of 8. And I also want to give credit, something I didn't realize. I watched the English version of Polytechnique and didn't realize till afterwards.
Oh, wow.
The technical marvel of this kind of blows my mind, but he filmed the entire story simultaneously in French and in English.
Yeah, which is
so
incredible.
You can watch the French version and with the English subtitles, or the English version with French subtitles, or you can just find the language you want to watch it in, because they would shoot the scene in French and then shoot the exact same scene in English, and then had 2 edits of the film, which is mind-blowing to me, but pretty incredible.
It is incredible. And in our Canadian context, bilingual country, I think it's was important to do that as well. Yeah, I'm at 4.5, almost 5 stars with this one. I have 3 other of his films at 5. This is the best of his 4.5-star films. It's better than Dune in my estimation, and it's number 4 for me. So we're in a similar spot with this film. Okay, so let's move on. 2009, this film, I believe, screened at Cannes, the Cannes Film Festival, and got a lot of accolades and awards here. But the next year, his next film really announced Villeneuve's arrival in Hollywood and globally, because this film garnered his first Oscar nomination. It's a film called Incendies, came out in 2010. It's actually an adaptation from a play, which those can be dicey sometimes. It can be difficult to adapt a stage play to the big screen, just like it's difficult to adapt a book like Dune to the big screen. But I think Villeneuve accomplished that in spades with this. So this just a little bit of a synopsis. The story is about Canadian twins, and interesting, the son in Incendies is the killer in Polytechnique, same actor. And so if you've seen Polytechnique before you go into Incendies, you're already sort of preconditioned what to think about him. And he is a bit of a jerk in this film as well. He's the unsympathetic son of a deranged mother who has just passed away. And the film starts in Montreal. Brother and sister, they're sitting with a notary. Mom has died. They're going through the will, and they receive 2 letters. And they receive a note that one note says that they are to find their father, who they didn't realize is still alive in the Middle East. And another note says they are to find their brother, and they didn't even know at this point they had a brother. And so that starts this story, this sweeping, sprawling story that takes the daughter primarily. The son is a little begrudging to follow along, but he does eventually, to the Middle East. And it's a bit of a puzzle. We start putting together the backstory of their mother as she walks around the places where she walked in her upbringing in a war-torn country. The country's unnamed in the film, but a lot of people have paralleled it with some of the Lebanese Civil War conflicts. It's filmed in Jordan. So Dune is not the first experience Villeneuve has filming in Jordan. It was filmed in Jordan and in Montreal. So I think it's just a beautifully constructed, sort of compelling puzzle of a story. And it really opens our eyes to the trauma of war on individuals and families. I mean, from our Canadian vantage point, sometimes we see it from a distance, but this throws us right in the midst of a war-torn country. And I thought this was an utter masterpiece. This is one I revisit time and time again. Kleiner, I was on you and some friends of ours to watch this one. I think you had a chance to view this recently too. What were your thoughts on Incendies?
Well, it's funny just because it's all to your credit that I saw it for the first time this year. And yet it was a film, probably just because of being a Canadian cinephile, that was always etched into my mind. I even remember going to a different movie at the movie theater in downtown Ottawa when Incendies was first coming out, and I saw it playing in the theater next door, and then that year being Oscar nominated, and it won, right? No,
it didn't win. Should have won. It didn't win, but
should have won.
In my mind, it won.
But just remember that being a big deal, right? And taking note of that. So it's always been in the back of my mind of something I've got to see. And then Denny took off with this whole career. And then anyways, but yeah, because of you and your insistence of what a masterpiece it was, I was finally able to sit down and watch this film.
I probably oversold it to you a bit, but
well, I mean, I don't know. It's a hard film to oversell because as long as you don't say anything too much, other than like the synopsis you just gave, it's hard to oversell because it is such a unique and complicated thing. As long as you don't give too much away, and actually, it just even what you just said, the synopsis made me think of like, oh man, for a guy who took off, who focused on parenting for 9 years. In several of his films, he's had a pretty explicit focus on childhood and the parental relationship in several of his films.
Yeah.
Pretty heavy.
And if I can just interject quickly, his father is actually a notary. He's the son of a father who's a notary.
Oh, no way.
I just found that out recently, so that's kind of interesting too. So obviously there's some personal backstory stuff being woven in. I guess he watched the play and was just blown away by the stage play and said, I need to bring this to the big screen. He was just so blown away by it. So.
Well, for good reason. I mean, it is a powerful story. And it is a story, at least for me, upon one viewing, that definitely coalesced and had a greater impact because of its conclusion. Throughout the film, like halfway through the film, I was fully engaged, but I definitely was sort of like not sure where this is going. I'm not quite as emotionally invested as I would like to, given the atrocities that are being portrayed on screen. But again, the ending really brings things together in a way you did not expect. And again, you don't want to see too much, but it is heartbreaking in the best way. And it is a true work of artistic empathy, because it's a cyclical narrative. Right. And the effects of that and the change we see in the characters from beginning to end is really powerful, and has a lot to teach and say. And I don't want to see too much more. It is a great film.
No, this is really one you don't want to go in with very little knowledge of the film, and certainly the last 15 to 20 minutes really does elevate it. But the opening scene, I mean, we got Radiohead, You and Whose Army just blaring. We see these children in the military, and they're getting their head shaved, and they got their automatic weapons, and all of a sudden it cuts back to Montreal with this reading of this will, and you're trying to, from the start, you're trying to figure out how does it all connect, and then the pieces of the puzzle slowly connect. The performances are great, and specifically the mother, who we get to see flashbacks of her life in her younger years, played by Lubna Azabel. Just a phenomenal performance. And I think at its core, it's really a heart of the power and the perseverance of and the love of a mother. And it's a powerful reminder that even those closest to us in our family, we don't know their whole story. We've all been shaped by our backstories, good, bad, and ugly. And so I can't fully judge no man, woman, or child because I haven't walked a mile in their shoes, right? Even my own wife and kids who I know, right? They are more than my relationship with them. They have a past and a story which shapes us. And this movie portrays that, I think, as well as any I've seen. And it's one of the best endings of any movie, I believe, in history. So this is the pinnacle for me. This is my favorite Denis Villeneuve film. It's remained my favorite. This is one I watch on Mother's Day most years, and that can seem like a strange choice for Mother's Day. It's violent and harrowing, but when you get underneath that, it really is at its heart the powerful story of a mother's love for her children, like very few others. So it's my favorite.
Wow.
Where you got this one on your list?
So it's 4.5 for me, but again, maybe that changes over time when I return to it. Eventually, because this is a film.
It rewards rewatches.
Absolutely.
And I will say this and Sicario. We'll get to Sicario. These are the two that you know how it's going to play out, but you rewatch it, and if you're still on the edge of your seat, even if you know how it's going to turn out, that's a sign of a great film in my mind. I get that with this and Sicario. So. Yeah, sorry, so I cut you off there. Where is this?
No. Yeah, so on Sunday CD, I'd put it. I have it at number 5.
Okay.
At 5 of 8, 4.5 stars. A near masterpiece for me. Again, a lot of that has to do with just the reflection of that first experience is sort of very unique and jarring, and you're trying to piece it together as you described. And so I look forward to a second viewing because I'll be interested to see how that pieces together.
Yeah, and I look forward to Villeneuve as much as I'm looking forward to Dune Part Two, he's had a good sci-fi run. I love sci-fi, but I would love
Right.
to see him go back to some of
Yeah.
the essence of some of his earlier works too, and I think he will. So.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's Incendies. Then we're fast forwarding a couple of years. 2013 was an interesting year for Villeneuve. He released not one but two films in 2013. One more smaller scale, one more larger scale. So let's talk about the film Prisoners first. That was released in 2013. Just a little brief synopsis before I get your thoughts on Prisoners, Kleiner. It's a 2013 American thriller from a screenplay by Aaron Guzikowski. It has a great ensemble cast, which includes Hugh Jackman, Jake Gyllenhaal, Viola Davis, Maria Bello, Terrence Howard, Paul Dano. It's a pretty loaded cast. It's probably his biggest A-list cast to date, certainly. And the plot basically takes place in Pennsylvania. We got a couple of friends in Pennsylvania. I don't know if I want to visit Pennsylvania after seeing the mayor of Easttown this year. Prisoners.
Not this neighborhood.
It's not high on my place to visit list. So it takes place in Pennsylvania and it focuses. Yeah, and we have teenage daughters, so this is one that you find yourself relating to as well, probably as I did. The abduction of two young girls and the subsequent search for the suspected abductor by the police. And Jake Gyllenhaal plays the sort of detective on the case, and Hugh Jackman plays the father, just traumatized by this and tries to sort of take matters into his own hands as the story progresses. I don't want to spoil too much of the plot, but it's another edge of your seat thriller, and I was pretty captivated by this even on my rewatch recently. What were your thoughts on Prisoner? Have you seen this one more than once, Kleiner, or was this the first?
No, I've only seen it once, and again,
Okay.
that it was another one of his earlier ones that just hung in the background for so long, only recently got to finally see it. And it is a great film, and again, I'm curious to see how I feel upon a second viewing. Because it definitely, for me, hovered between 4 stars, which is what I ended up giving it, and 4.5 stars. But very much, I mean, that what I said at the beginning, reflections of the examination of human choice in the face of evil. How do we respond? How do we decide or choose to respond to horrible acts of evil that have been done to us? And all the pathways are presented for us over the course of the story in this incredible cast. And again, the thematic themes, like with storytellers that I liked, like David Fincher, like this is dark, morose, bleak examination of the human experience. But again, there is a beautiful complexity to it through the portrayals that Hugh Jackman gives to Viola Davis and her husband, and of course Jake Gyllenhaal, who, like, I think Villeneuve actually just recently has helped me just accept the fact that I think Jake Gyllenhaal is one of, if not my favorite living actor. I mean, I don't think he has I don't think he has a switch for not being intense. He's always intense even when he's in a comedic setting, he's intense. It's pretty hilarious, but he is so good in this film, so amazing, and in many ways is the center that drives us through this complex narrative of a mystery. But yeah, I don't know. It's just it's bleak, it's hard, it's difficult, but cathartic, I think. And again, those lessons we learn through characters vicariously of, again, how would we respond? And yeah, it is just a great film, and I'm sure it will only get stronger upon second viewing.
Yeah, cinematography's superb. This is, I believe, Villeneuve's first collaboration with Roger Deakins, nominated for Best Cinematography. You can see why. The shots, the choices, cinematography in this film are phenomenal. You mentioned Gyllenhaal. I want to give kudos to Jackman as well. This is a pretty intense role for him. I kept waiting for the claws to come out there.
Yeah,
him to go.
Well, it's a way we haven't really seen him before. I feel like I can't recall another role where Hugh Jackman. Well, rarely does Hugh Jackman portray a character who we outright disagree with, right? Usually he is the positive protagonist that we aspire to be. And in this case, he is the exact opposite. And that, I don't feel like he rarely portrays that, but he does it so well.
It's a complex character, right? Because you kind of sympathize with him on the one hand, but you cringe at the methods he's taking to take things into his own hand. It really puts those questions to the forefront. What would you do in this situation as a father? Left thinking, what would I do, right?
Yeah.
And it really puts in your face, like we talked about, living in the midst of a world of violence and evil, like Incendies and some of his other films. So that allure, the temptation to gain control through violence and force in the midst of chaos, right? And that's a very real allure to everyone. The one we follow named Jesus, that was an allure to him too, right? From on down, how we will respond to that. So I thought those questions were, and again, yeah, very bleak. Bleak is a good word. Man, Pennsylvania seems very bleak. Can't be that.
I don't know. Anyone lives in Pennsylvania.
So that's Prisoners. Where's that in your rankings, Glider? You said it's a 4-star?
That's a 4-star film. Might only get better upon repeated viewings, but I slipped that at numbers 7 out of 8, which again is all relative because I just put Dune above that for at this point. But
yeah,
ironically, I should confess that my bottom 4 of 8 are all ones I've only seen this year, seen once recently. And so there's probably more to come.
So there's no recency bias necessarily there. Yeah, sometimes I find with Villeneuve, sometimes they grow with re-watches. So this one was a 4 after first watch, and I kind of bumped it up. It's my lowest sort of 4.5-star film of his. So it's number 6 for me as well. So similar to yours, which is by no means a knock on it. It's great. But just comparatively speaking with some of his other films, that's where it landed for me. So the same year, we get a double dose, or dare I say triple dose, of Jake Gyllenhaal, because another film in 2013, more of a smaller scale film, but quite compelling as well, is the film Enemy, which stars Jake Gyllenhaal playing sort of not one but 2 roles in this film. It's hard to really explain this film. It's it almost feels like, if you didn't tell me who was directing it, I might have thought it was like a David Lynch film. It's very Lynchian. It's very, very surreal, dreamlike. And so I guess you have this college professor who discovers sort of an actor that looks exactly like him, his doppelganger, so to speak. And he actually seeks him out and they almost try to assume the role of each other. I don't want to give too much away. This one really is a mind bender. It's one that was a little lower for me on first viewing. I was kind of scratching my head. I'm like, great performance by Gyllenhaal, but what's going on? What does it all mean? I watched it again recently, and I think the light bulb was kind of going on. And it's very much full of metaphor. If you try and take it on its face, literally, that's not the way to read it. Just like that's not the way to read other stories and myths and narratives, right? Spiders are not taking over the world. There's a lot of spiders in this film. And Villeneuve has gone on the record saying that, this is not about 2 characters. This is about an inner struggle, a battle within the subconscious. So Gyllenhaal is playing both his conscious and his subconscious. And there's this wrestling match towards being faithful and having fidelity with his wife, or living a life of promiscuity, that sort of inner struggle. And so when seen in that light, you can really sort of connect a little bit with what Villeneuve is going for here. But I thought the performances of Gyllenhaal again in this film are off the charts. Pretty outstanding what he did. What were your thoughts on Enemy? I know it's a little lower for you maybe, but
yeah, well, and I was shocked when I noticed on Letterboxd that your rating upon second viewing went so much higher.
I dropped it back down. I went from 3.5 to 4.5. I'm like, oh no, it's
did you?
Okay, it's 4. It's a high 4 for me now.
Yeah, I mean, again, upon one viewing, it's 3.5 for me, and so it's my lowest ranked and reviewed film for him. Yeah. Partially because upon first viewing, and you and I mean, for the casual moviegoer, this is probably going to be an unpleasant experience, and
be the toughest one. Yeah.
Probably not. But for someone who's well versed in sort of like this trippy psychologically entwined mysteries, I mean, the reality is, for me, the best comparison to it is Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo. And there's even a scene where the poster for Vertigo appears in the background, and those kinds of things never happen by accident. And so it is very much like an extreme version of of Hitchcock's Vertigo, and if you know Vertigo, you know what sort of maybe you're getting into in terms of mystery and identity and all this kind of stuff. But it sort of takes it to a further extreme. And there's even actually my favorite film, which we'll get to in a minute by Villeneuve. There's even a similarity in some of the computer graphics and imagery towards the end of Enemy and towards the end of my favorite film of his. But so just seeing the similarities. But not only is Jake Gyllenhaal incredible in this role, in spite of the mystery and maybe for me the difficulty to unwrap all the mystery, but is her name Sarah Gadon?
Sarah Gadon, yeah.
Sarah Gadon, a Canadian actress. Yeah. She's appeared in a couple of Villeneuve's films, I believe, more than one.
She's phenomenal. Yeah,
she is incredible in this. And she's, what is it, Kim? I wrote it down from Vertigo, the popular actress who wasn't in a whole lot, but
Kim Novak. Yeah,
Kim Novak. Yeah, she kind of takes on that character type, really perfectly in Enemy. But anyways, I just to say it's a mystery wrapped up in an enigma, wrapped up in a mystery, and there's a lot symbolically to unpack. And so when it's that wrapped up, it really is just about the experience at first and the performances, and they're all stellar. They're all top notch. There's nothing to speak ill against there.
Yeah.
But
so I landed on 4-star for Enemy, which is a very good film, but it's number 7 for me out of his 10 at the end of the day. We will, in the show notes, I'll put like a deeper dive into, I think, what is a good explanation of some of the metaphors in this film. So if you've watched the film and you're scratching your head and you want to kind of connect the dots a bit more, I'll put some resources there for those watching. Okay, let's get into his next film now. 2015. Again, another big budget film, big A-list cast. The film is called Sicario. Adam, why don't you give us a bit of the synopsis of Sicario? I know we both adore this film. Give us the broad strokes on what's happening in this film.
Well, let me see if I have a brief summary. It's a difficult thing to quickly articulate. Let me just read this thing. Villeneuve seamlessly ties viewer and protagonist together as we are blindly dragged along with Emily Blunt on a thrilling and yet utterly confusing CIA mission across the Mexican border involving the cartel.
Good synopsis.
I feel like it's all you need to know. I feel like that's all you can know. Seeing Sicario in theaters in 2015 is an irreplaceable memory for me cinematically. That was definitely that film in that theater where I fell in love with Denis Villeneuve, because it was just, I didn't know what was happening. Like, I was just so caught up in this thrilling CIA operation, in a story that is told in a way that the viewer really, literally, the viewer knows less than the protagonist, because at least the protagonist, played by Emily Blunt, is a trained FBI at first and then CIA, I think, officer. And so she at least has the background, the training, the expertise to at least know the context, while we're just dragged along with her. But she's dragged into this operation crossing borders and is constantly asking, why are we doing this? What is happening? What is the game plan here? And they're not permitted to tell her.
Right.
And so she's just swept up in this. In the end, it becomes this provocative and powerful confrontation with evil, societal evil and personal evil, and what to do with it. But just it's a ride. Like, it's just Sicario's ride. And I've revisited the film multiple times. There is very few films that have a soundscape and sound design like this film.
Yes.
Again, in the theater the first time, the whole room was shaking. So much of this film is from, not so much, but some very poignant moments of bird's eye view, sort of like drone shots almost. And yet the cinematography by Roger Deakins is incredible. It's a mission film, but it's a mission film with a meaning, and the mystery. It's not even like a mystery. You just literally don't know what's happening or why until things begin to piece together towards the end. And every time I've rewatched the film, I'm just on the edge of my seat. Even though I know how it's going to end, I'm just
Right.
riveted.
Yeah.
And every performance is perfect. This is in contention for my number one Villeneuve. It is a masterpiece. But of course, it once again has quite a bleak worldview. It has at least a bleak engagement with the world, and so it falls at number 2 for me at 5-star masterpiece. But it's really neck and neck because I really adore Sicario.
Yeah, me as well. Again, theater experience similar. Just blown away. Again, you're on the edge of your seat watching it in my home theater. I think my neighbor thought a helicopter was landing in the backyard at one point. Like, just rumbling. I mean, this is probably my favorite. Hard to pick a favorite, but this might be my favorite sound mix of all of his films. The visuals, I noted in my written review on Letterboxd, and I'll post both of our Letterboxd handles. You can see these and other reviews. Shameless plug for both of us there. But I wrote in my written review that the visuals are very fascinating. What Deakins has done, because we're thrust into this world, this harrowing world, just like Kate, Emily Blunt's character, is up close and personal, and really uncomfortable. There are some shots that just linger, maybe longer than they need to, but that's the whole point, to make us feel that discomfort. Right out of the gate, the opening sort of prologue scene in particular is just, it's skin crawling. But we're taking this journey with Kate. We are up and close and personal. We're disoriented. We don't understand what's going on, but our skin is crawling. We're uncomfortable. And then, there's these visuals where they just pan out. All of a sudden we get these these aerial shots of the whole landscape. They let us basically maybe contemplate from a distance what we've just seen, catch our breath, and all of a sudden, boom, we're thrust again back into maybe an extraction scene across the border, which is your heart's in your throat for scenes such as that one. And it's very fascinating how the visuals actually add to the disorientation and the bleakness of the film. Blunt's character, I know she's been accused of the writing of her character from some critics. I think it's very well written. I think we see her as being a strong-willed, someone who has good moral compass and integrity, yet there's a vulnerable side to her as well. She's caught living in this sort of world, this underbelly. She's going in aware with her training, but there's still some naivety there, which is, I think it's very true. That's a realistic situation. And she's caught in this world of violence and toxicity, mostly by males. And she's a female trying to stay true to her moral compass in the midst of all of this harrowing stuff around her. And I really thought her performance was very captivating. She's one of my favorite actresses, and I thought she was phenomenal. But unlike some other films like Dune we talked about, I think some of the lesser characters are great in this film as well. Josh Brolin, Benicio del Toro, Jeffrey Donovan, Daniel Kaluuya. I mean, all of them, they get some good screen time in some moments where we kind of get to know their character and who they are. And so I appreciate that. This is not just about Kate, but there's some other characters around the periphery that we get to know and engage with. And it's a masterpiece. 5 stars for me as well. It's number 3 at the end of the day.
Yeah, Emily Blunt is amazing. She's also probably one of my first or second favorite female actors out there. She's incredible in this.
Now, if her and Jake Gyllenhaal could ever get together on a film, there you go.
Oh man. And just want to give a shout out to the late great Johan Johansson, who was the composer. Yes. Sadly, died at a young age just a few years ago. But he worked with Villeneuve on a few projects and was always young-ish, but up and coming in the ranks in credibility. And again, the sound design and score of this film is like nothing else. And so,
yeah. And one final little caveat before we move on. Sometimes in the world, we tend to see the world in and out, good and bad, us and them. And this movie does a good job of really showing us that we think government good, yes, drug cartel bad, but we see there's an underbelly on both, right? And there are a lot of shades of gray on both sides of the equation, both sides of the border there. So I thought they did an excellent job in holding that tension, the moral ambiguity in most of these characters. Yeah. Okay, that's Sicario, 2015. We agree, a masterpiece. 2016, Adam, take it away. What's next?
Well, yeah, 2016.
This is your moment. Spoiler alert.
Well, I hope we can have some fun discussion about this, because 2016. Well, first, it just needs to be said that, like, in my mind, Denis has an unmatchable trilogy because somehow he pulled off in 3 years. Sicario 2015, Arrival 2016, and Blade Runner 2049 2017, which is just mind blowing because they're all incredible, epic films. Anyways, but Arrival in 2016 is a masterpiece. It's 5 stars for me. It's my number one easily. And I say easily, even though I said Sicario is fighting for it. I say easily because it is Arrival is Denis Villeneuve's most elegant and hopeful film. So that's what edges it out for me. But it is also a provocative science fiction film about space and time, our place on this planet, our purpose on this planet. It's also an evocative exploration of grief. Once again, a motherly grief. And Arrival. Aliens come to Earth, and it's not that kind of alien landing, first contact kind of film. It's an examination of linguistics. Amy Adams plays a professor of linguistics, and she is brought in to help communicate with those who have arrived, the septopods. And there's 12 of them spread throughout the planet, 12 ships, identical. And we have to learn to communicate. But with that comes this fascinating exploration of the limitations of language given a cultural context, that we can only know so much about any given subject, especially the most important subjects in existence, like the purpose of our existence, to a point because of the limitations of our cultural language and context. And therefore, we need the benefit of other cultures and other contexts and other languages in order to piece together the mystery of our own meaning. But it's Arrival is it's a film that I weep every time by the end watching it, because it is a powerful story of a mother and a child. It is an exploration of grief, but it's also this exploration of our purpose and meaning here. And it unfolds slowly as a mystery, using time as a concept in folding within itself. And I'm making it sound way more complex than it is, because it's not that complex. It is at first a very straightforward first contact kind of story, but it's powerful, it's purposeful, it's evocative, beautifully shot, beautifully performed. I love Arrival, and I want to know why Jason doesn't.
It's a 4-star film for me. So it's 4 stars, which means it's a very good film. And for all the reasons you said and more, I like this film. I think Amy Adams is superb, another female protagonist. She does phenomenal work in this film. There are certain scenes and moments in this film that are on par with any scenes in any Denis Villeneuve film. I mean, the scenes where they're going up into the spaceship and interacting with the heptapods. They name Abbott and Costello. Some of these scenes are great. I was just rewatching this, and my kids heard a bit of a rumble because there's some awesome sound in this movie as well, and they came down kind of mid-movie and were just captivated by what they were seeing on screen, and I need to show this to them start to finish. My issue, and this is the reason it's not a 4.5 or 5-star film for me, is I unlike Sicario, where some of those periphery characters get a little more depth, really missed an opportunity with Renner's character. I thought he's just there for exposition and explaining some things. He's got this long exposition midway through the movie that just seemed kind of out of place, and I really wanted more from him, because as the story unfolds, he becomes a key character. But as good as Amy Adams is, I thought there was an opportunity there to go a little deeper in the characterization of him. And I felt, to be honest, the big twist at the end of this movie, it felt like I was a little bit emotionally manipulated. You got this opening scene where you think, spoiler alert, stop right now if you haven't already, if you haven't seen this film, but at the start of the film, you think that Amy Adams is having flashbacks of a child that she bore that got sick and died of cancer at a relatively young age. And you realize as the story progresses that she's getting these visions of the future realities, not that what might happen, but what will happen. And then that leads to some of the philosophical issues that lead me to believe this is actually the bleakest of Denis Villeneuve's films, which I find interesting. You said it's the most hopeful. I think it's the most bleak, because there's a question that's asked near the end of the movie. If you knew your life from start to finish, would you change anything? And I'm like, well, could we change anything? I mean, if it just seems that these aliens, they show up and they're like, in 3,000 years, we're going to need your help. Well, it seems like everything's sort of predetermined, everything's fated, the choices are already etched in stone. That seems pretty bleak to me. It doesn't seem like, unlike Dune, where Timothée Chalamet is having some visions of what might occur, it just seems like this is how things are going to be. So could she actually have chosen to do things differently? That's maybe I'm misreading that or misseeing it, but it just seems like a very fated, sort of predetermined ideology that to me seems very bleak, which really takes the movie down a couple notches at the end of the film for me. Although for 75% of the film, I'm like, I'm with it. I'm like, yes, this is great. And then the ending was kind of like, really?
Well, okay. So I appreciate that. I struggle with that because I think we both come at this.
But that's my own personal philosophy too. That's not cinematically what's on screen. That's just emotionally the responses.
Well, what's funny though is that I think we both have the same aversion to any presented or projected sense of determinism about the universe. But I think in our aversion to that, I think you and I come at from different theological and philosophical perspectives, which is exciting to me. But at the same time, again, I brought up choice at the beginning, that choice is this constant theme in a lot of Villeneuve's work. And for me, the film Arrival is much less, I would say it's not even really espousing anything about the universe and the nature of the universe or existence and time itself. Again, the focus is instead on human choice, and that in the face of inevitables, will we choose to pursue love and meaning in spite of the inevitable suffering we will face? And that choice that we all make subconsciously, but in this case of this story, consciously, is incredibly powerful. I wouldn't call that manipulative, because I think that gets at the heart of what we would all hope to aspire for ourselves. But even in the story of the faith that we hold to, that Christ himself would choose to embrace that inevitable suffering and sacrifice for the sake of love and meaning and purpose. And that's what I'm seeing analogously presented in this film. I don't see, and that again, like the aliens saying that in 3,000 years we need your help. I see that as an invitation for participation in the nature of time and existence. Not that it's set and determined, but rather that requires the involvement in the work of others. That we can, one, on planet Earth, the whole really through line of the film and the narrative, right? The book that she publishes at the end is the universal language, that it requires all cultures and peoples, tribes, and tongues in order to examine the story and the mystery itself. But then on top of that, there's this invitation from the stars to participate in a greater purpose and mission, that we need them and they need us. And that one is, and that there isn't a separation or segregation from time, but rather unfolds in itself for us to share in with them.
Yeah, I think they could have told that story, and I appreciated those parts of the meta narrative. I think they could have done that without presupposing a predetermined closed future, which I think doesn't allow for authentic human choice. I think when you have a totally predetermined future, that's like oil and water. It just doesn't mix. And so our choices aren't really authentic if everything is fated and pre-programmed, whether it's 3,000 years down the road or the baby I'm going to birth with this scientist in the near future, right? So those are,
But I think you would. I think so. I think so. Again, I think it's important to understand that Arrival's primary theme is not about the nature of time itself, but rather our choices in the face of the inevitable, or what we can likely anticipate. And to me, that's the greater theme to examine, because narrative, telling stories, or the narrative of human existence, There are themes, there are movements, if you think of it musically, that are repeated and told once and once, time and time again, right? History repeats itself in the worst ways, but also in the best ways. And God himself, if he is responsible for the telling of the very existence and narrative of our lives, he knows, and is determined. Redemptive narratives, not deterministic, but determined to tell redemptive narratives of sacrifice and love, in order for those movements and those measures of music to be to come back and be repeated time and time again. And I see that's how that not only is that how the film, I feel, hits me emotionally, but that's where it leads me to meditate, which then again is all the more reason for this film for me to be a masterpiece, because it evokes this sense of storytelling and narrative that has repeated or expected or known truths, or plot points that are essential to the human experience, and knows that that's part of our story, that's part of our participation in it. But with that comes this two-way interaction with those beyond, Earth itself. But I don't know.
That's well put. That's well said. Yeah, and I really appreciated the themes of authentic relationship and working together, and sort of the call for unity on this pale blue dot we call Earth. And you see how different governments are responding to the arrival of these aliens and how there's some tension building. I was really tracking along. But at the end of the day, I mean, however a movie ends, that's sort of the note that you're left to ponder and resonate on. And I guess, again, because of my theological and philosophical bent towards an open future and an authentic God who relates, it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. That being said, it's a 4-star film for me. I love it for all those reasons that you said. And it's your favorite. It's number 8 for me for those reasons. But it's a film that I will, again, 4 stars for me is rewatchable. So all Denis films are rewatchable, and I will, with fresh new eyes now, given what you said, go back and try and continue to mine and plumb the depths of Arrival. All right, that brings us to the final film from Villeneuve we're going to review today. We already talked about the most recent Dune. So previous to Dune was the 2017, and I'll call it a masterpiece because I think it is a masterpiece in a world that's beloved to me, going back to the 80s, Blade Runner 2049. Blade Runner is one of my most beloved films of the 80s. In my childhood, I was captivated by this film. Harrison Ford, this futuristic world, Rutger Hauer. If you're not familiar with the world of Blade Runner, it's a futuristic kind of cyberpunk world in which there are AI, artificial intelligence, called replicants, and the Blade Runner title is given to those enforcers who are to sort of seek out and destroy some of these replicants. It's a world in which corporations are mass producing these replicants that commingle and intermix with real human lives. At its core, although it's sort of veiled in sci-fi, it really is a deep meditation on what it means to be human, explores some of the depths of the human condition, identity, unity, whole lot of deep themes. And Blade Runner 2049, I think it's a masterpiece, and I was cautiously optimistic when this film came out because I love the Blade Runner franchise. I love Denis Villeneuve. I'm like, come on, man, don't screw this up for me. I need this movie to be great. And I went to see it in theater, and my goodness, it was like what you said with Sicario, that rings true for me and my theater viewing experience of this film. It's a lengthy runtime. It's closer to 3 hours and 2 hours, I believe, but I was just riveted. Again, much like Dune, the world building in this film is phenomenal. Harrison Ford still going strong. We got a new Indiana Jones movie to look forward to coming up. He's great. The last hour he shows up in this film. But the cast across the board is stellar. What are your thoughts on the film, Kleiner? Let's interact about this one a little bit, because I think we both enjoy this film a lot. Jared Leto's not your cup of tea, I guess, but yeah.
What's your what?
Jared Leto. I mean, I know he's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
your
yeah.
favorite actor, but yeah.
Well, no, I love Blade Runner 2049. It was for many years 5 stars for me. It was in the my top ranks of films that year. And again, like completed this sort of like loose trilogy in my mind of Villeneuve masterwork. Um, and I've watched it several times and revisited it. And maybe I'll put it this way: while watching the film, it's 5 stars for me. But when the movie ends and I think about the film, I'm just like, are there small things I would change? Yeah, there would be. Yeah, maybe the runtime is a little unnecessary. Even Ridley Scott, the director of the original Blade Runner and producer on this one, he said the movie's half hour too long. I wouldn't be that harsh. I would say probably cut out 10 or 15 minutes and it probably would come to an. The reality is this is a slow and patient film. It's quiet. It's still. I mean, the music at times is booming and jarring almost, but it's very effective. And yeah, I do think Jared Leto's either performance or the writing of the character is it just feels slightly out of place. Originally, apparently, according to IMDb, David Bowie was originally intended to be cast in that role, which then in my mind, I'm like, that would have been perfect.
That would have been interesting.
It would have been, in my mind, knowing him in other film roles, it would have just added maybe a bit more life to the performance, where Leto is just going for something very stoic and almost like omniscient, almost in his words and actions. And he's only in a couple scenes, so it's not like it's a really big deal. Jared Leto's on screen for like 10 minutes at most in a 2-hour and 45-minute movie.
Yeah.
So it's very minor things. But at the same time, I also just recognize that this is a film that I'm sure many people just wouldn't have the patience for. Because once again, we have Ryan Gosling doing what I think he does incredibly, which is be stoic and be
perfect casting choice.
Appear to have nothing going on, and he's done this in several films, and yet there is this powerful sympathy that gets drawn or communicated across the screen, in spite of what he's doing when in movies like Drive or First, what's it called?
First Man.
Yeah. First Man, which I love. Like, these are all 3 films where they just set the camera up and Ryan Gosling, all right, do nothing, just look, right? Like, just and it's so good. It's so evocative to me, maybe not to others, but Blade Runner 2049 is just, there's lots that it evokes. Maybe the story is not nearly as complex as the first film, and some people, that's a criticism, but it's a meditative movie, and I think it's very well done. It's incredible work. I enjoy it I get swept up in it every time I revisit it. So yeah,
me as well. I just watched this after watching Dune, literally yesterday, and just swept away in the narrative. Contemplative is a good word to describe. Maybe the most contemplative film. So if you're going in thinking for a high octane action sci-fi movie, you might be disappointed. There are certainly compelling action sequences, but underneath all of that, some of the deep questions to contemplate. And, the Ryan Gosling character, again, spoiler alert, if you haven't seen the film, go watch it. But, he starts the film, he knows his role, his job is to seek out these outdated replicants. Dave Bautista does great in a small role at the beginning of this film, back in Dune and Dune Part 2. I'm sure he'll get more screen time. It's fascinating to see Gosling, and then throughout this series of events and discoveries and memories, whether they're real or implanted memories, he's unsure, starts to come to the conclusion that he is the miracle child that everyone is seeking out for good or nefarious purposes. And so he gets this sort of feeling that he's someone special, right? Almost like Neo in the Matrix. I am the one. I am the chosen one. And then he goes from euphoria to the reality that, no, I'm not the one. And yet he still makes choices, right? He still makes some choices, some self-sacrificial choices in the final hour of the film that I think the movie sort of presupposes philosophically that our humanness is tied to the choices that we make. What it means to be fully human is how we live, how we relate, versus some other sort of boxes we might check that tells us we're human or not human. And so I think it really cuts down to the core of what it means to be human. And there's a whole lot of the Galatians syndrome is maybe a callback or a connection to some of what's in the book of Galatians. And I'll let our listeners sort of scour the internet for some of those connection points. You alluded to that, I think, in your written review. And there's some interesting biblical and religious metaphors and allusions scattered throughout the film as well. So it does reward rewatching. I know it's the better part of 3 hours, and we better land the plane here, or this pod will be the better part of 3 hours. But so where does Blade Runner 49 at the end of the day? Where does it fall on your list?
It falls at number 4. It just because of losing a half star. Polytechnique bumped it out of the top 3, as I said, which is funny because I keep talking about this sort of loose trilogy, and it would have been the top 3: Arrival, Sicario, Blade Runner. But then I saw Polytechnique and it just sort of like edged it out a little bit.
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're giving some love to that film, because that's a film that probably most of our listeners, even if they're familiar with Denny, maybe haven't seen Polytechnique, so you can watch it in English or French.
Unlike most of the films we referred to, Polytechnique is short. It's a short film. It's
an hour and a half, I believe. Yeah, it is short. You can watch the English and the French in the same amount of time as watching Blade Runner 2049. That would be too bleak, though.
No.
Yeah. So for me, Blade Runner, it's still. I mean, I understand Jared Leto. He may not have been the perfect cast, but it's still, again, for that 10 minutes on screen, I'm not gonna dock it. It's still number 2 for me. It's still right there, closely hot on the heels of Incendies. I love the sci-fi genre, but I love the slow burn, the contemplative side. It's just a perfect mix of everything I appreciate in film, and so it's one I'll continue to revisit. And I think it's even better than the original, dare I say?
I agree.
As much as I love Blade Runner, I like this one better. Yeah, cool. So Dune Part 2, hopefully coming in the next year or two. Now, let me just throw this question out to you: like, if there was any adapted screenplay or original style of movie, if you had a phone call with Denis and you could pitch him an idea, let's pitch something to him, where would you want him to see go with the rest of his career, given what we've seen in the last decade?
I don't know about the rest of his career. I seem to if I look at the filmmakers I adore and I love to like revisit and even rank their films, I seem to like people who stay in their lane, so to speak.
Yeah.
Fincher, Christopher Nolan, whoever else I would think of. Guys who have a sort of a set pattern and maybe occasionally have a diversion. And certainly with all of these films, if not most of them, most if not all, there seems to be a sort of a lane of tone and style that Villeneuve plays with. And so, more of that is wonderful. The particulars, I mean, his tone would lend itself great to a Western, in my opinion. But kind of what you said earlier, I'd love to see him come back to planet Earth or a contemporary time period. And like, what would Denis Villeneuve do with a family drama? I don't know. I would love to know the answers to that question.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, here's another film in theaters. Let's give the keys to the James Bond franchise to Villeneuve for a film or two. What would that look like?
Yeah, well, he would take it in a heartbeat. And again, I don't think that's that far outside of his wheelhouse, right? His current lane,
be
right?
Certainly interesting.
It would be amazing, right? That's the thing. It would be amazing if he did it, or Christopher Nolan did it, or even David Fincher, any of these guys we've mentioned. Like, they would all do amazing things with a franchise like that. But what happens when they're given a smaller scale? That's what I'd be interested in.
Yeah, and I'm with you there. I would love to see him go from this big epic Dune, just to show his versatility, to something more on a smaller scale with compelling characters, like characters in a family drama. So who knows? The future's open, right? We'll see.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, Kleiner, thanks, man. It's been good to hang out, and hopefully this has perked some of our viewers' interest in diving deeper into the world of Denis Villeneuve and film. So you've got a lot to chew on. Give us some feedback in the comments section, either on this video, or you can check out our letterbox written reviews. We'd love to hear your feedback, or if you have any future videos or themes you'd like me or Adam and I to tag up on, we'd love to get your feedback there as well. What's your favorite Denis Villeneuve film and why? Give us those comments in the comment section as well. So thanks, Kleiner. Appreciate hanging out with me on this Monday afternoon.
Thanks, man.
Enjoy the rest of your day and your week, and we'll take up again soon, I'm sure.
All right. See ya.
All right. Take care, everyone.